Wow, we get that before we actually start. Where in Seattle are you, Christopher? Oh, you're muted now. Okay.
I'm in Alki Beach.
Oh, so you're in West Seattle also. So yeah, you know West Seattle. Except you have it even worse because you're up that end of the.
I know the pain, but see, I never have to really go anyplace because
No, there are those signs saying I wouldn't leave even if I could. Right. Yeah, it's a very nice part of the city, Carol, but it's a bridge got closed down to connect the bridge that connects it to the rest of the city for maintenance, structural problems. So it's good. It's a 2-year process, they say.
Yeah. When is it supposed to be done?
A year from now, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm on sabbatical, so I really don't care.
Oh, good. You got even up.
Yeah.
I actually live next door to the head of the Seattle Department of Transportation, so he has a stake in getting fixed.
Oh, there you go.
I also try not to talk too much business with him.
All right. Whereabouts do you live in West Seattle?
I'm below the junction. I mean, I'm west of the junction, and just south, sort of down from that Rite Aid that's on California. If you were driving down California.
Okay. Do you have one of those views from like 39th or 40th?
No, I don't have a view. I'm near a view. I come down to Alki when I walk through Schmitz Park and kind of come out there sometimes.
Okay. Well, I guess it's time, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Carol and Karen here. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this, Carol, too. I'll say that again, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you two are ready, I think we can begin. Karen, Carol just went away. Okay, good. I just look up the way these screens are. To everyone who's joining us from the various and many places that you are, because of the way these programs happen. So the shortcoming of which is we're not all in the same room, which we would love to be, but the positive is that you can be all over the place. And we at Elliott Bay Bunk Company, which is here on Duwamish land in the city of Seattle, are delighted that you're with us for this, what should be a very engaging, important, and provocative discussion with Carol Anderson and Christopher Sebastian Parker, occasioned by the publication of Professor Carol Anderson's newest book, the second, and the subtitle of which is Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, a book that's recently been published and you've got a lot of conversation, discussion going. The second, of course, being the Second Amendment, and how it's been used, misused, viewed, and worked against some people, worked in favor of others, with careful, cogent arguments, as Professor Carol Anderson is known for doing. She is known to many readers already for her earlier books, Bourgeois Radicals and Eyes of the Prize, and probably the book that engendered the one of the largest readerships was a very recent book, White Rage. Now, this book, I think, also is taking its place because among the many books that have come out and are out and have been out on race, on where things are, where things have been, and the place of guns, and who's calling what on what their place is. Her book plays a real role, and we're delighted she's doing this today. She actually has been to Seattle numerous times. I think most recently it was Seattle Arts and Lectures when they were still having people in the place, which we will get there again. Christopher Sebastian Parker is a professor at the University of Washington and is, as he said, presently on sabbatical this year, so he's not having to deal with the traffic I was just dealing with. And he also is the author of a couple of important books, which they just went away on my notes here. And they include Fighting for Democracy, Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South, and Change They Can't Believe In, the Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America. And he's also just played a significant role in academic spheres and also in bringing his things he's written about to a larger public. This program, actually, let me circle back to Carol Anderson. She is also a professor, I've been saying, and is presently the chair of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, where she is with us tonight. This program also is being co-presented by the Northwest African American Museum, which is a frequent partner of ours, both when we've been able to do programs in person and hopefully soon again. And it's also, for all sorts of reasons, I think will be apparent as this discussion goes along, by the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. And I think Karen will be putting some things in the chat on all these groups. She'll also be putting links to both Carol Anderson and Christopher Parker's books. So today we're, the professors, Anderson and Parker, will each, well, Shu will talk and then we'll have a conversation. We hope you will put questions in the Q&A portal, and Christopher will add those to the conversation a little later in the program. And I will absent myself from this part and come back at the end to thank them and thank you again, which we do now. And to say, please now join in giving good attention and virtual applause to Carol Anderson and Christopher Sebastian Parker. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. And I'm going to start off by reading a section from chapter 3, which is The Right to Kill Negroes. Freedom was right there, hanging by the barrel of a gun and ink on a piece of paper. For nearly 500,000 free Blacks and 4 million people who were no longer enslaved, this could have been the moment when they stepped fully into the protection and rights of American citizenship. But that was not going to happen. It couldn't be. With the Second Amendment a flashpoint, as Black people asserted their right to bear arms, the right to a well-regulated militia, and the right to self-defense, and America responded with its right to kill Negroes. That pathway to fractured citizenship was built by the battered but defiant Confederacy, President Andrew Johnson's unvarnished hatred of Black people, and the equivocation of the North about the rights and place of African Americans. The result was a nation half-heartedly trying to build an egalitarian society on the ashes of slavery. And those ashes, when mixed with the rivers of blood from Black people who thought citizenship would come through military service, who believed that they had the right to self-defense, and who hoped after the Civil War that they were now Americans, hardened into nearly impenetrable barriers. Andrew Johnson, who ascended to the presidency after Lincoln's assassination, was instrumental in sabotaging efforts to craft a political and legal environment in which the formerly enslaved and free Blacks could live fully. He pardoned many leaders of the Confederacy, welcomed those unrepentant rebels into their old positions in state government, and did not wince as they drafted new constitutions, such as Louisiana's, that boldly stated, "We hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive benefit of the white race." And perhaps even more important, the state's new constitution affirmed the founding principle that people of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States. Johnson was also unfazed, as his emissary, Carl Schurz, reported in late 1865 on the miles and miles of recently butchered Black bodies hanging from trees, lying in ditches, and clogging roadways, dismembered limbs strewn everywhere, severed ears dotting the landscape, burning and decomposing flesh, making it almost impossible to breathe. While Schurz was clearly rattled by the way murder stalks and revels in undisputed carnage in the South, Johnson had no qualms whatsoever about this slow motion genocide. The president was also unconcerned about the rise of Black codes promulgated by these new old governments in the defeated South. These laws were an astonishing affront to emancipation and were designed to regain control of Black people's labor and lives, and to ensure that Black people who had tasted freedom would be defenseless against this seismic push back into a state of neo-servitude and subjugation. They were also, just as in the days of slavery, banned from owning weapons. Florida's legislation, for example, forbid Negroes, mulattoes, or other persons of color from possessing guns, ammunition, or blade weapons without getting the approval of whites in authority. For those who were caught with a weapon, the punishment was a public whipping of 39 stripes. Similarly, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina made it illegal to sell, give, or rent firearms or ammunition of any description to any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto. In Louisiana, Blacks couldn't even carry a weapon. African Americans countered by petitioning, insisting, and demanding that they now had Second Amendment rights. The Bulletin of the African Methodist Episcopal Church explained that the freedmen have as good a right to keep firearms as any other citizens. A Black newspaper in Georgia went one further and laid out that not only did the formerly enslaved have the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, but that no one had the right to strip them of their guns simply because they were Black, thereby placing them at the mercy of others. But that simply wasn't so. That amendment was not designed to help them. Its inclusion in the Constitution was to ensure a role for militias to control the enslaved. The defeat of the Confederacy, despite all of the language about a new birth of freedom, had not changed the meaning or the goal of the second. The anti-Blackness that undergirded slavery, that made it possible, that sustained it for centuries, still remained strong and unrepentant in post-Civil War America. And the hard-fought for change in the legal status of Black people could not scramble that DNA, the operating principles of anti-Blackness.
Wow. I don't find myself in this position often where I have to fret about following someone else. It's usually the other way around. And that is my friend and colleague, Carol Anderson, at her best. I mean, I can just say, I don't even know where to begin, but let me just start with a little history, to the history professor, for everybody else out here. I've known Carol, I knew her work before I actually met her in person. As I wrote my dissertation, I happened on her dissertation and later, her book, Eyes Off the Prize, The United Nations and African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1941 to 1955. And I've been a fan ever since, and I'm really thrilled that she's taken the leap into more public scholarship because more people need to know about her work and indeed her voice and experience her presence, as we all have just done. So what can I say? I'm just kind of like, I'm not often awed, but I mean, what can I say? Anyway, so thank you for such a fantastic and passionate reading of your work. And Carol, it makes me kind of want to go into the time after the Civil War, the period after the Civil War, redemption, just to give people a little more context, right? So before I go through this sort of linear way of the interview that I wanted to present, you kind of threw me a curveball with that. So now you're obliged to set up the context a little more about like, wait a second, because a lot of people are like, wait a minute, Reconstruction happened, right? And then it didn't. And many people are really fuzzy on that. So can you please take a few moments on elaborating like how this happened, with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and all that other stuff?
And so, after the Civil War, we end up in this period where you get this moment where the Confederacy comes back into power because of Andrew Johnson. And with them it becomes the rise of these domestic terrorist organizations and the rise of these paramilitary groups. And they see it as their job to disarm Black people and to put them back in their place. The carnage that Carl Schurz is laying out is what led Annette Gordon Reed to talk about a slow motion genocide. You have Black folks fighting back. You have the rise of Black militias that are trying to fight back, but they are overwhelmed by the power of this white supremacist force and the weak-kneed response from the federal government, till the point where, you've got the radical Republicans in Congress who are passing, they passed the 13th Amendment, which ratified in December 1865. Then you get the 14th Amendment and you get the 15th Amendment. And they think, and that with the Enforcement Acts, they think they have provided the structure of citizenship and democracy for these freed people. But you've got not only the power of the violence raining down on Black folks and the weak political response, but you also have the US Supreme Court that guts the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, as well as the Third Enforcement Act, that was designed to curtail the Klan and the white camellias and the red shirts. And instead, they gave them carte blanche to do their damage. And it is in that moment where we then get the Compromise of 1877, where Rutherford B. Hayes, as part of his deal in order to become president, helps withdraw the remaining few Union troops out of the South. You then get this negotiated period of redemption where the white supremacists are back in power and they're trying to figure out, how do we make the South strong again? And so they're negotiating with Black folks who still have the right to vote. Then we get to Jim Crow, the rise of Jim Crow, where they're like, wait a minute, poor Black folk are voting with poor white folk. We can't have this. We cannot have this. And so you get the rise of Jim Crow and massive disfranchisement. And a key element in this massive disfranchisement in pushing Black folks back in their place is the violence that rained down on them. So this is where we get the rise of lynching, but this is also where we get the massive array of laws about where Black people can be, where they can't be, how they have to be able to vote. And those laws are written in a race neutral way because of the 15th Amendment, but they are racially targeted. So this is what has drawn me to my work, is looking at the fractured citizenship of African Americans. How in these moments where Black folks are pushing forward to gain access to their citizenship, you have this wave of laws and policy and violence that pushes them back.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Wow. All right, I actually want to, there's another question I want to ask you, because it's sort of ironic in a sense that they're forever trying to take guns from Black folks, but it was because of these guns that Black folks had that the Union won the Civil War, right? That is a deep irony, is it not?
Well, and I've got to say, it's because in the war for independence, we're going to go back a little bit further. In the war for independence, initially Black folks were banned from joining the Continental Army because there was this fear of Black folks with guns. And this is that anti-Blackness that I'm talking about. That Black people are somebody said, one of the guys back then said they were domestically dangerous. So that they are dangerous, they are a threat. And so there was this ban, but the British are kicking some USDA grade A prime beef butt. They are just bringing it. And so the Continental Army is looking up here and they're going, okay, we got to do something. And what they decide to do is to begin to open up enlistment into the Continental Army to what they call the Negroes. And what that meant then were that the North had slavery as well. And so you had the North saying, if you are willing to fight for us, fight for the rebels, fight for the patriots, then you will get your freedom. And so the North is offering freedom to the enslaved to be able to join the Continental Army and fend off the British. This creates a Continental Army that is fully integrated. This is an integrated fighting force, and they stiffen. they stiffened. And so the British are like, dang. And so they decided to go what they call to hit the soft underbelly, which is the South. And so they hit Georgia and they took Georgia like that. And so now they're headed up to South Carolina, Charleston. And Charleston is looking up, the government in Charleston is looking up because the vast majority of their white men are used for the militia. And the role of the militia in the South is to curtail slave revolts, to curtail slave uprisings. And they have deployed most of their white men to do that work. So they only have 750 white men available to face 8,000 British troops that are coming at them. And so George Washington sends his emissary down there and he says, look, you know what you've got to do. You don't have enough white men for what the British are bringing. What you've got to do is you have to arm the enslaved. The South Carolina government was, as they said, we were alarmed, horrified. And they said, we don't even know if this is a nation worth fighting for that would ask us to do something like this. And so they were willing to think through withdrawing from the war, claiming their neutrality, and taking their chances with the king rather than arm the enslaved. So this is not the story we normally get about the founding fathers and this war for independence where everybody is, but the way that racism works and the fear of Black people with guns. When George Washington sent his other emissary down there, General Nathaniel Greene, and Greene is trying everything. He's like, look, they have already taken Charleston. You are on the run. You are like a government in exile. You have got to do this. And they said, no. And he said, what I'm dealing with is this dreaded fear of Blacks with arms.
The funny thing, and I say funny both ha ha because the United States is getting its ass kicked, A, B, or the colonies were. But B, here's another part to this though, that what eventually made Washington to agree to the accession of Black folks was because Lloyd Dunmore was like, hey, you guys should come fight for us, right? And then George Washington was like, oh shit, we need to do this, right? And that's how that went down.
Right. Dunmore, you know, when he put before, he was the guy, the royal governor in Virginia. When he said, you know, come fight for the king and you will get your freedom. And you have this massive influx of Black folks running to the British. Yes. It just sent shockwaves through the colonists who saw their visions of an independent nation just evaporating. And what that flight of Black folks to fighting for the British also did is that it provided a pretext to explain the collapse of South Carolina. So the press was talking about, look at how Black folks have betrayed us. But what they didn't mention was that Black folks in the colonial army were there for longer stretches of time, and they had a lower AWOL rate than the white enlistees. But that kind of service in the service of America did not count. And this is one of the things that we would see in this kind of recurring narrative. Black betrayal, Black threat, Blacks are dangerous, and they cannot be trusted with arms.
Yeah, but another part of this recurring narrative though, Carol, is like whenever we're not at war, you know, Black folks are oppressed, right? But as soon as conflict threatens, right, they put the bat signal up, right?
The exigencies of war, we see it consistently. Yep. So yep. It is like it is like with the War of 1812. It was also with a slave revolt in Louisiana in 1811, the largest slave revolt, you know, in North America, and there was a Black militia there that they had tried to disarm and disband. But they were the best fighting force there. They were the best fighting militia there in Louisiana. And so the governor had tried to square the circle with the whites in New Orleans who wanted this Black militia disbanded. And so he tried to keep them and remove the Black leadership, the officer class, but have the whites officers in charge of them. But this Black militia fought hard, and they were integral in putting down a slave revolt, because this is the role of the militia in slave times, to put down slave revolts. And they got nothing for that. They were then called upon again to fight in the War of 1812 in the Battle of New Orleans under Andrew Jackson. And he promised them all kinds of equality and equity, and we will treat you and like the men, the fighting men that you are. Once they had done that work, they were then sent out to the swamps as a labor battalion to do the work that white men didn't want to do. I mean, this is a recurring theme, but one of the key pieces that I want to bring out in this Second Amendment component is the role of the militia. It is that militia that is absolutely essential for understanding the Second Amendment. We had the Constitutional Convention, and you saw the South playing hardball, basically saying the U.S. will, if you want a United States of America, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in the defense of slavery. So we're going to get the 3/5 clause. We're going to get 20 additional years on the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to get the fugitive slave clause. And what James Madison, who was one of the architects of the Constitution, did was he also put the control of the militia under the federal government. And that's because the militia had been so weak and unreliable in the war for independence. And when that Constitution then hit the ratification convention in Virginia, because ratification had stalled, when it got to Virginia, Madison ran into the buzzsaw of Patrick Henry and George Mason, who were like, you've got that militia under the federal government. We can't trust the federal government to protect us. The federal government will have people in there like from Massachusetts and from like Pennsylvania. You know that the North detests slavery. When we have a slave revolt and they don't send the militia in, we will be left defenseless. And so they promised to basically scuttle the Constitution, or to push for a new constitutional convention, unless they got a Bill of Rights that would help them protect slavery. That's the role of the Second Amendment.
I feel like I'm in school again, Professor. All right. So here's a let me just have you elaborate on a couple other things. First of all, I want to point out to the people, there were two Fugitive Slave Acts, right? The second one in 1850 not only permitted folks to recover their lost property, it actually enlisted federal law enforcement to do so free of charge, right? Yeah. Let's just get that one out of the way first, right? And so, and on the militia front, Black folks, were allowed to fight in militias, especially initially, right? Especially when it came to, getting the Indian problem, so-called Indian problem, under control, right? And they even fought in some militias during the War for Independence when they all came together to form the Continental Army. But Professor, can you elaborate on this second Militia Act of 1820 that was sponsored by John Calhoun, and the purpose behind that, and what was the impetus for that second Militia Act?
I can't get to that specifically because, that is really your area. Okay. But John Calhoun, so one of the things that I do know is, for instance, is that with that Black militia down in Louisiana, you started seeing a series of laws that were stripping them of their officer class, that were stripping them of access to public arms, and that by 1834 had them thoroughly disbanded. So that you had, because there was the fear of Black folks with guns, the fear of Black folks who were trained and who knew how to use these weapons and who knew what military formations looked like. You didn't want that kind of training, Black men to have that kind of training, because it was a threat, it was a danger to white society, it was a danger to slave society.
That's right. That's right. And the Haitian revolution happened in 1791, right? Yeah. That scared the bejesus out of white folks in the South, right? And a lot of things followed from that, right? One of which was the Militia Act of 1820. One of the other things I want to talk about before I really got to get to the rest of this is the significance of militia service and how that the not or barring Black folks from militia service affected the Dred Scott decision, right?
So one of the things that you had the 1792 Militia Act, right. And that 1792 Militia Act said that all able-bodied white men from the ages of 18 to 45 had to join the militia, and they had to own a gun. It became part of understanding that this was their commitment to citizenship. This was the way that they showed their service to the nation. And so you get this linkage of whiteness with guns, with citizenship. When we get to Dred Scott, and Dred Scott was about a Black man, Dred Scott, who was enslaved, but had his master had taken him to free soil, to Illinois as well as to Wisconsin, and then had taken him back to Missouri, which was a slave state. Dred Scott said, yo, I'm free. I lived on free soil for years. I'm free. And that was the question. Roger Taney, Chief Justice Roger Taney, in a horrific, infamous decision, wrote that Black people weren't citizens at the founding. They weren't citizens when they were applying for passports. The Secretary of State turned them down, as did the Attorney General of the United States. They can't carry the mail. And if they were citizens, they would be able to go easily from state to state, and they could carry weapons wherever they went. You know, and then he wrote that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect.
That's the one. that is the one, right?
Dred Scott decision. So you saw how citizenship was tied up with access to guns. They could have guns wherever they went. And making it clear, as looking at issues of passports, looking at issues of being able to be a mail carrier, that they're not citizens. They have not been, nor will they ever be. That was Dred Scott.
Thank you. That's it. I was waiting for you to say those infamous words, that Black people have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And that was slave as well as free folks.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And this was the thing, is that the precarity of Black life meant that free Blacks really weren't free. You had these legal decisions coming through that said that they're not really free men. That means if they were really free, they would be citizens. And so you have a series of laws coming up, not only in the South, but in the North as well, that bans African Americans, that bans free Blacks from being able to carry weapons.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. And you are killing it tonight, Professor. This is you all the time. Okay, so here's a question for you. So then how do we explain, the Deacons for Defense and Justice in the 1950s, right, in the early 1960s in Louisiana, and compare them to the Panthers in the Bay Area in the early to mid 1960s? Why were the Deacons permitted to carry weapons in the South, no less, right? In the deep South in Louisiana,
right?
The Panthers were barred from doing it once they showed up at the California State Capitol in Sacramento. So can you tell us a little bit about the Deacons for Defense and Justice, please?
Yes.
And the Panthers.
So the Deacons for Defense and Justice were found in Bogalusa, Louisiana, and their role was to provide the armed support for the nonviolent civil rights workers who were trying to register Black folks to vote in the Deep South. because those nonviolent workers were getting just terror just raining down on them from the Klan, from white supremacists who were beating them, who were shooting at them. And the Deacons for Defense then became because there had been a legacy in the Deep South, knowing that basically all that stood between Black people's lives and the slaughter were their guns. So there had been a history, a legacy of gun carrying in the Deep South, and the Deacons for Defense did that. What made that palatable was that you had a national narrative of the Deep South as being backward and retrograde and regressive and really not really American. They were just doing stuff that made the US look bad on the Cold War international stage. And you had this fight for what was seen as democracy. They were fighting so that people could vote. They were fighting so that people could just like live. So they were fighting for these kind of democratic principles. And they were fighting against a villain, a really almost a Hollywood type villain. Well, then when you move to the Panthers are in California. As I wrote in the book, Nina Simone wrote Mississippi.
You can say it, okay, Mississippi, goddamn. Okay, now go ahead.
Right. She didn't write California. And so California just had a very different kind of national narrative as the place where everything was possible. And so it didn't have the villainy behind it. And the Panthers were dealing with massive police brutality, the kind of brutality raining down on the Black community where Black folks were getting killed by the police, where they were getting beaten up, where they were getting falsely arrested. I mean, just brutality and no accountability in the system. And so the Black Panthers arose from that as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And part of their mechanism for self-defense is that they knew the law in California so that they could open carry. And they decided they would police the police. Well, policing the police, when the police have this aura as being the guardians of safety and security, that just, so you're getting this really contradictory narrative clashing, where Black folks are saying the cops are killing us. And the narrative is that the police are here as the defenders of all that is good, right, and just in the nation. And so the Oakland PD ran to Don Mulford, a conservative assemblyman in the California legislature, and said, you have got to help us with these Panthers. Every time we pull them over, we can't get them on anything because they know the law. So they're carrying licensed weapons, and they're carrying the kinds of weapons that they're allowed to have. We're not finding any sawed-off shotguns. They're carrying them, and they don't have them like there's no bullet in the chamber kind of deal. And they're not pointing it at anybody. We can't get them on anything. Can you help us make them illegal? And Mulford's like, I'm there. And he had the help of the NRA in drafting the Mulford Act, which banned open carry. And so it was a way to make illegal what the Panthers had been doing in order to try to curtail police violence in the Black community.
Very nice. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, Professor. So I want to ask you, okay, so I have to ask you, I feel obliged to ask you this question about the 1619 Project. Right, there's been a lot of hue and cry over this recently, and it extends to, someone who would be a colleague at North Carolina, but ultimately didn't get tenure because the guy for whom the journalism school at North Carolina is named had issues with Nikole Hannah-Jones possibly getting tenure there, right? So, and Nikole Hannah-Jones, for the uninitiated, was the driving force behind the 1619 Project. So I will let you elaborate briefly on the 1619 Project and whether or not you think any of the criticism is warranted or even legitimate.
Okay, and for full disclosure, I'm in the 1619 Project. So the book that's coming out in November, I have a chapter in there. What the criticism is about. So they found one little thing that Nicole corrected, right? But what the criticism is about is saying that slavery has a major impact on the United States and the development of this nation's political institutions, its legal structure, and its economic structure, and its social cultural structure. Slavery matters. And it does. There's no place where you can look at American society. When you look at, for instance, our political realm, our political parties, when you look at how our politics are set up, when you look at where we live, when you look at our churches, when you look at our foodways, all of these things, slavery has mattered. And the pushback is about wanting a narrative, wanting a history taught to our children that ignores the power of racism, the power of slavery, the power of racist institutions in shaping this nation. And it's to create these kind of cardboard heroes so that we just get that George Washington chopped down the cherry tree because he can't tell a lie. And that is supposed to pass itself off as history instead of understanding that these are human beings. These are complex, complicated human beings who are making choices. And those choices, some of them are good, some of them are bad. And if we don't understand how those choices were made and the forces that were driving these decisions, then we cannot deal with where we are right now. America right now makes no sense unless we understand the power and the force of slavery, of Jim Crow, and of our so-called post-racial society. None of it makes any sense.
I'll leave you. One last statement. I'll ask you a question to which I hope you respond, and I'm sure you will do so in very succinct and eloquent, eloquent fashion. Why study racism, Carol? Like, isn't that opening old wounds, right? Why go backwards? Why go to the past? Why emphasize you're a historian? Why emphasize, racism then? Because it's in the past. These people now, these white folks now, they aren't responsible for slavery and Jim Crow, right? Now, of course, this is not what I'm saying clearly, right? I mean, look at this. Right? These are not my words, but these are words of people who often come after Professor Anderson and people like her, who want to make sure we have a critical understanding of racism. And so why is this so important right now, right? Where our country's already divided, so why continue to divide it even more?
And I love this question. To me, this is like therapy. If you don't tell the truth, you never get well. And it's the way that, how do we understand how Kyle Rittenhouse, who was the 17-year-old white child who took an AR-15 that he illegally obtained, crossed state lines, and went into Kenosha, Wisconsin, where there was a protest because a Black man, Jacob Blake, had been shot in the back 7 times. And the police welcomed this Kyle Rittenhouse. We appreciate that you guys are here. We want some water. And then Kyle Rittenhouse goes and he guns down 3 people, killing 2 of them, seriously wounding a 3rd. He walks back to the police after shooting down 3 people with his hands up, and the police ignore him. They don't register threat with him.
Right.
How do we understand that when we juxtapose that to Tamir Rice, who was the 12-year-old child in Cleveland, Ohio, playing alone in the park in an open carry state, and he's playing with a toy gun, and the toy gun didn't have the orange tip on it, so it didn't register that it's a toy. But Ohio is an open carry state. And the open carry law says, as long as you're not pointing it at someone, as long as you're not threatening them, you can carry it. There's nobody around him in this park when he's got this toy gun. The police roll up and within 2 seconds, they shoot him dead. 2 seconds. And what they said was, we were afraid. He was a threat. He was dangerous. So how is it that Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old child, is a threat and dangerous in an open carry state when there's nobody around? But Kyle Rittenhouse, who is in a crowd of people carrying an illegally obtained AR-15, is welcome. We really appreciate you guys are here, and here's some water. So they recognize Kyle Rittenhouse's humanity. They did not recognize Tamir Rice's. If we don't understand how we got here, this thing keeps happening.
So no, great points, Professor. But I also want to highlight, I forgot the guy's name. I'm sure I did this, just to retain my sanity. The guy that shut up Mother Emanuel and killed 9 Black people. This dude got taken alive and they took him to Burger King, right?
Dylan Roof.
Dylan Roof. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Can you imagine if a Black man did that to some white parishioners?
No. So this is one of the other things on why study racism. It's the thing that we know that's in our ether. So when we say that, if you look at the insurrection of January 6th, where whites stormed the US Capitol to overturn an election, to basically stage a coup, that we say that if we know that if those folks had been Black, it would have been a massacre. Why do we know that? Because we do know that. We saw that when there was a Black Lives Matter protest movement, a protest march, that they had called out uniformed troops standing there, weaponed up, ready for them. So the sense of threat, the sense of violence that rains down on just I've got the last chapter is called "How Can I Be Unarmed When It Is My Blackness That You Fear?" When Blackness is the threat, being armed makes you exponentially dangerous, but being unarmed also makes you vulnerable and you're still dangerous. That is the conundrum that is around the Second Amendment. When we understand that the Second Amendment is designed to curtail Black people's rights, to subjugate them, and that it was the bribe that was offered to the South to not have a new constitutional convention, that we need to treat that Second Amendment the way that we currently treat the 3/5 clause, as something that is basically an unholy deal, a deal made with the devil, and that it is designed to destroy, to not even recognize Black people's full humanity. It is designed to subjugate.
But Professor, doesn't the Second Amendment protect? There are a lot of Black armed self-defense groups that are springing up everywhere these days.
Yes,
Does it not protect them, the Second Amendment?
This book started with the killing of Philando Castile.
Right.
Philando Castile was pulled over by police, and the police officer asked for his ID. Philando Castile was following NRA guidelines that said, "Officer, I just want to let you know that I have a license to carry weapon with me. I am reaching now for my ID the way that you had asked." And the police officer started shooting. Philando Castile was gunned down, not for threatening an officer, not for brandishing a weapon, not for pulling the trigger, for simply merely having a gun. And the officer said, "I was afraid. I saw danger. I felt threatened."
So what you're saying is that these folks who belong in these Black armed self-defense group, they run the risk of becoming slaughtered, right? Because of the fact they're trying to protect themselves from all of these, I shouldn't say all of these, well, I'll say it, these MAGA people, right? That really, let's just call it what it is, right? Not only do they not like Black people, they don't like any people of color, right? And they don't like any people of color. They don't like feminists, right? So basically, we should all be on the lookout, right? It starts with anti-Blackness, right? And then it just sort of builds out in concentric circles from that, right?
And one of the things that I document in the book is that when Black people have sought to defend themselves, so that in Atlanta during the race riot of 1906, what happened was massive state power came in for the kill. When in Knoxville in 1919, massive state power came in for the kill. Tulsa in 1919, Elaine, Arkansas, massive state power came in for the kill. So this is the thing. We've got this sense of, well, you've got the right to self-defense against, folks trying to attack you. Think about this way. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old who had Skittles and iced tea, clearly unarmed, minding his own doggone business, going back to the condo to finish watching the NBA All-Stars game. George Zimmerman sees this Black child and says, there's something wrong with this guy. He looks like he's on drugs or something. He's really suspicious. Those kind, they always get away. And he gets his loaded 9mm, and stalks this child through the neighborhood. And he guns him down. And Zimmerman claims self-defense. When he's the one who is armed, he's the one who engaged, he's the one who stalked. And the jury looked at this and said, yes, you're right. You have the right to self-defense, George Zimmerman. It is that disparity that is steeped in anti-Blackness. Remember the thugification of Trayvon, how they turned this 17-year-old child, they made him taller, they made him heavier, they grilled him up, they thugified him. And it was the way of saying, see this Black threat. That's the reality. So I get the armed Black militias. What we have to do, the work we have to do in America, is to dismantle anti-Blackness. That's the key work that has to be done here. We have to rethink what real security and real safety looks like.
So, I mean, I think ultimately you're right, Professor, but color me cynical.
Hell surprise.
Color me, and I use the term color very intentionally, color me very cynical about the prospect of that ever happening. About sort of, and which I know it sounds pessimistic, but if you think about the history of Black folks, right? It's hard to be an optimist if you're Black.
Well, one of the things that I look at is that where my hope is that Black folks have always fought. They have always had the imagination about what freedom looked like, and they have always fought for it. So during the Middle Passage, they fought for their freedom. During slavery, they resisted and they fought. During the Civil War, they fought. During Jim Crow, they fought. I feel like the Tuskegee Airmen, we fight, we fight, we fight.
Right,
and
right.
That fight is absolutely essential. What we cannot do is stop fighting, because the forces of reaction never give up.
That's right. If you look at American history, anytime there's racial progress, racial regress is not far behind. And one of the things that I want to mention, and it really surprised me when I read An American Dilemma, Gunnar Myrdal's, magisterial work, but most of the work was actually done by Ralph Bunche, a Black political scientist, right? Let's keep that 100%. Myrdal was hired, Bunche did most of the work, right? Whereas that story, I mean, that's a story, that's a narrative that continues to give, right? But one of the things that I found really arresting, Carol, is that when they interviewed Bunche and his team interviewed Black Southerners in the late 1930s, they actually had more hope for America than did white folks, right? I'm not sure I understand that to this day, right? But to your point about fighting, right? Can you educate at least me on this? Like, why was that? Given that that was a solidly Jim Crow era, in the Deep South. Can you explain this to me?
And I really think it has to do with the kind of strength of imagining what freedom feels like, what it looks like. The thing about America is that there is America, and then there are the aspirations of what America says it is. And Black folks have always fought on the aspirational plane. Where we end up with the craziness is where folks treat those aspirations as achievement, where they treat we hold these truths to be self-evident as if they're actually realized. When Black folks are going, no son, no son, no son. And so it is in that fight on that aspirational plane. When you have those aspirations, when you have that imaginary about freedom, about justice, about equality, you have hope and you have faith. And faith is powerful, just powerful. That's what you see resonating. That's what you see when you think about the absolute subjugation and the degradation of slavery, how those folks would run away, how they would fight, how they would resist because they conceptualized what freedom looked like. When you can conceptualize that, dealing in a system that says you are nothing but property and we own you and we can do to you whatever we want. Wow. Yeah. That's what folks are drawing on.
So it's this hope. It's this hope that the United States will finally bring its social practices into alignment with this professed principles.
And it's more than hope, because faith without works is like, boy, you ain't doing nothing. So okay, so I just reworked that Bible verse, but you know what I mean. and so what you see is the constant mobilization and the organizing. You see the constant strategy at the grassroots, at the political level, in the cultural level, that constant work towards freedom, that constant work toward making that aspirational plane a reality.
And so I think I will turn it back over to Rick on this so he can do the outro, but I just want to ask just one last question. I think I said I was going to ask a question 3 questions ago, but but here's the last one. So what made you turn from your scholarship, right? From that for which you were trained to do, right? Going to the archives and doing this, real historical work, that, people like your colleagues, I think myself included, would read and cite and learn, to a more public facing scholarship, right? So was there an inflection point where you were just like, I got to do this now?
There really was. It was, the first 2 books were traditional historical works. Then came White Rage, and White Rage emerged out of, I was in my home office, I'm watching TV, and Ferguson is on fire. And it didn't matter which one of the stations I was watching. I had the remote in my hand. So CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, they were all saying the same thing. Look at Black folks burning up where they live. Ooh, look at those Black people burning up who burns up where they live? Look at all of that Black rage. And I went, that's not Black rage, that is white rage. Mm-hmm. And I went, that is white rage. And I started writing. And because I was like, we are so focused in on the flames, we miss the kindling. And the kindling are those policies that systematically undermine African-American citizenship rights. So looking at what happens in our school systems after Brown, looking at the criminal justice system, looking at the political system and massive voter suppression, those policies do damage. And so that's how And I saw that the role that I had to play as a historian was to correct this narrative that was floating out there that just Black folks were just burning up something because they were just burning up something because they were just mad. No, this is kindling. When we understand the kindling, when we understand those policies and the tripwire for those policies, the catalyst for those policies, and the catalysts are Black people advancing towards their citizenship rights, and that is the trigger. Black aspirations, Black achievement. When we look, for instance, at the 2020 election, and Black folks turned out, the turnout rate was phenomenal. And the response has been a wave of voter suppression laws. That's white rage. That's what sent me on this path, was to provide my historical expertise to help explain the ways that racism works in the United States, what those barriers are, what the genesis of those things are.
Wow. I'm just going to end on that note. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Carol Anderson. Thank you for your time. And thank you so much for your works. They're so beautifully written and accessible and thoroughly researched. Those two things don't often coincide, but you do a really nice job of making it work. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Rick for the outro.
Okay, I will sort of add my little part, but say thank you, Christopher, and I'll thank you again when we get to this. And this last comments, I actually omitted Carol's most recent book, The One Person, One Vote, which also is a book that's in this more public sphere after the what we're more probably seen as more specialized academic books. But because that book also is part of this conversation. Also to say, Karen posted a link to the 1619 Project book, which is coming out November 16th, middle of November. And the publisher of that is this publisher in New York, One World, an imprint that's been doing a really remarkable series of books. But a particular thing they've done, for anthologies are often published, but they managed to make their books almost like a choral feeling, these multiple voices that are each distinct, but also become a larger singular voice. And there's a book called 400 Souls they did. There's another one called Black Futures. And I think very much this 1619 Project, which is, so a lot of the work has already been in the New York Times Magazine and elsewhere. But anyway, Carol's part of that is also one reason that is something to look forward to. I also neglected to mention the National Book Critics Circle award that you got for White Rage. And Christopher, Karen put it in the link, has been part of some of the current discussions too, with Rachel Bloom doing an op-ed piece for Washington Post about why the GOP can't quit Trump. And I mentioned the two books he's written. I believe there's a work on a third that's developing, and you can clarify this because the title I've seen is "Haven't We Seen This?" and then in brackets it says the word "stuff." No,
yeah, no, that was actually supposed to be my third book, but that got superseded by The Great White Hope: Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of America.
That's come to the fore. Good. That's okay. Probably what the sabbatical is partly doing. Yes. I will. In the chat, there were two comments that came in. One significant because of who and where it came from. There's a writer who writes fiction and poetry, but she is from Vietnam and lives in Indonesia because the spouse is a diplomat. But and she just wrote from tomorrow, actually, because it is tomorrow in Indonesia, about what important conversation this was that everyone should be listening to this. This is a writer named Nguyen Phan Quay Mai, who has done a lot of work in her own fiction about the legacy of what's called the American War over there, but also has been a lot of touch with writers in the US, such as Joseph Komunyakaa, who served in the Vietnam War. And another from Jay Ware, who just said this has been hugely intelligent and knowledgeable, and so many sneaky and devious ways to drown the facts and keep Black people from succeeding. So comments of praise. We do certainly hope you come and get the book or order it from us. Second, again, thank also the Northwest African American Museum and the Alliance for Gun Responsibility for their part. And we hope to see everyone soon in person again. we're getting closer. And so thank you both, and thank you all for being with us. And this is so important, what you've written about, what you've talked about, and for us now to read and heed and be aware of. So thank you all. Thanks, Carol. Take care. Thanks for being up late too. It's getting on in the night there.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Christopher.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.